Hello, thank you everyone for being here today to this event. It's the very first event in term 2 of the SOAS Center of Buddhist Studies. Also, it's the very first event of our Robert Ho Foundation lecture series in Chinese Buddhism for this academic year. We are very grateful to the Robert Ho Foundation and the several years of support that they are giving to the Center of Buddhist Studies. It's a very nice lecture series, so every year we have 3 events. Each event has a lecture, an evening talk, and then a seminar Saturday morning. And it's divided usually thematically. So we have an event more focusing on pre-modern history and text and language. And then we have another event also on the pre-modern, but focusing more on art history, art, and also rituals. And then we have an event about modern contemporary China. And this time, we start with the event on modern contemporary China. We will have other 2 events in May. Yumi Kim is coming to talk about arts and rituals of Liao Buddhism. And we're going to have Stephanie Balkwell towards the end of May to talk about her book and her work on women in Buddhism. Please check our websites, all the details are there. But today we are here for Ron Tao Lai, my dear friend and colleague, Ron Tao. We know each other for too long, not saying how long, otherwise we feel old, but for a long time. And it's a really a great pleasure for me to introduce her. Ron Tao right now is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and East Asia Studies at McGill University, where she also gained her PhD. Before, she was Assistant Professor at the University of Southern California and a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute, the National University of Singapore. And your connection with the Robert Ho Foundation is also quite deep because you also had a fellowship. You were a research fellow of the Robert Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhist Studies. I know Ron Tao very well because we had lots of exchanges talking about Republican China. And her work has been different issues, but really her major contribution, and a contribution that we are all very grateful for, is her work on Buddhist education and how the Sangha education has changed in the late Qing and the Republican era around the figure of Taishu, but also going beyond that. Her PhD dissertation was about the Wuchan Institute of Buddhist Studies, and her forthcoming monograph, the long title, which I never remember by heart, so I have to read it. So you're forgiven. The title is Citizen Bodhisattvas, Education, Student Monks, and Citizenship in Modern Chinese Buddhism, and is forthcoming this summer by Brill, and we are very much looking forward to that. It's a very nice book where you see the creation of new identity and also networks of young monks. So a new form of identity, of identification. So being a student of a particular Fo Xue Yuan, particular Institute of Buddhist Studies, was giving identity to monks rather than the master, maybe, that they were disciple of. So Ron Tao is looking at this shifting of identities formation, but also the network of students and how they were networking and creating new communities. And networks are important in Chinese Buddhism, are important in religious studies in general, and I think it's something else that we have discussed for a long time. Networks of Buddhism, looking at, for me, Ron Tao is more looking at the modern, so Republican era, more contemporary time. Recently, in the last 10 years, there have been quite interesting work coming out from colleagues. Eric Hammerstrom did an amazing book about the Huayan networks, looking at the Republican era, and he published a book about focusing on Institute of Buddhist Studies, so how education was the center before the kind of identity formation of this particular network that he was looking at. Ron Tao has been doing for a few years now, so I understand there will be a new monograph coming up, hopefully soon, eventually working on Tiantai networks, but looking at Tiantai networks in contemporary era, also trans-regional, transnational networks, and of Tiantai school, so looking at what happened also to these monks and going outside, far from the particular temple where the network of the main master was coming from, and also looking at this connection. I remember reading a book chapter of yours of a few years ago that was really looking at China, Southeast Asia, and the new reality of a Tiantai Buddhism. Usually when we think of Tiantai, we always think of a pre-modern time, so we are extremely grateful that we see what happened to the Tiantai school in the modern and contemporary time, how it's been fitting the new historical period, but also contributing to creating new features of Chinese Buddhism. Today, Ron Tao will give a talk. You have the title here, What is in a Transmission, Identity, and Lineage Networks in Modern Chinese Buddhism. And we are going to see her also on Saturday morning. The room is in Brunei Gallery B304 on the third floor. Please check the website in case I'm wrong. And we are going to do some discussion on methodology, how to study modern Chinese Buddhism. If you have registered already for the event, you should have also received some preliminary readings that Ron Tao has circulated through our amazing center assistant, Haruka. If you have not registered yet, but you intend to come to the seminar, please go on the website. There is an online form, and then you are going to receive automatically the reading to prepare for Saturday. But for now, let's look at the Tiantai lineage, and we're going to have a 45, 50 minutes talk, and then, of course, there will be time for an open discussion with all of you. So please help me to welcome Ron Tao.
Thank you so much. Okay, am I good? All right, thank you so much, Stefania. Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, thank you for being here. So I would like really to start my lecture with an expression of gratitude and acknowledgement, of course. And first of all, acknowledgement and gratitude goes to Dr. Stefania Travanen, for the very, very kind invitation. It's good to see an old friend again. Old in that we have known each other for a very long time. For the very, really generous and kind invitation, especially given that she's actually on research leave, so she has to come all the way back, right, just to introduce me and host the event. So really, thank you so much for that, and also gratitude, towards the Robert Ichino Family Foundation for again, right, its very generous support, a generous gift to endow the current series, and of course, for its continued, really, effort and support, in nurturing Buddhist studies around the globe. And so I think that should really serve as a model, right? I mean, for, this kind of a very, very, very important contribution between different communities, right, and the academia. So, for that, I am immensely grateful. And of course, last but definitely not the least, to the staff members of the Center of Buddhist Studies here at SOAS, especially Haruka Saito, for organizing this, for meticulously kind of keeping track of everything, because this has been like kind of in process and in planning for a while, right? And for helping, of course, with all the logistics. So, and for that, please accept my really, deepest gratitudes. That nice introduction kind of, I think, helped maybe skipped a few slides as well, if we want. I would really like to, for today, have maybe a kind of a three parts to my talk. So I will talk a little bit about the state of the field and why am I even on this project. And then I will move on to giving a kind of analysis of a case studies, or at least introduce a case studies. I am currently working on two different groups of people in two different lineages. And those of you who have signed up for the Saturday seminar will get, to read and talk a little bit more about the second example, around Yongquan Monastery in Fuzhou, Fujian. And so today we will be focusing on the transnational Tiantai lineage. And lastly, of course, I hope to, end this talk by, I guess, reflecting on current or possible analytical framework in thinking about networked kinships, and also, I guess, orthodoxy, legitimacy, and so on. So that, in a nutshell, is what the talk would look like today. So again, I don't know how much time we have, but I will basically stop when Stefania tells me to. So, when she waves, I will just, abruptly end my lecture. Okay. So, and state of the field, right? I think the study of modern Chinese Buddhism has really come a long way in the last, I don't know, since we were in grad school, right? So remember the lonely old days when we were the only one working on the modern period, when everyone, around you were like a pre-modern textualist and so on and so forth. I don't know about you, I still remember those days, right? So again, I don't really think that this has to be an either-or kind of a zero-sum game, but and also believe that it is possible to work towards creating a field, right, that really has a space for everybody to thrive. So, and therefore, I mean, I am really grateful and encouraged to see the kind of changes, right, that is taking place, within the study of Chinese Buddhism, where there is a growing number of books, dissertations, and, inquiries from, prospective graduate students, and so on and so forth. So if we're to, really take a quick glance at the kind of work being done currently or, again, right, I mean, published in the last 15 years, 10, 15 years or so, you will notice that what scholars call Humanistic Buddhism or Renjian Fojiao, reformist Buddhism, right? And of course, very often, I think, surrounding certain reformist monks such as Taishu and so on and so forth. So that it's still the dominant theme, right? Both in terms of the self-representation of Chinese Buddhists, as well as the scholarly discourse on modern Chinese Buddhism, right? So then basically, right, a lot of these works published recently are on groups who identified as humanistic Buddhist groups. And that is especially true when people want to talk about global Chinese Buddhism. Because these humanistic Buddhist groups, such as Ciji, such as Foguangshan, the Buddha's-liked mountain, or maybe to a lesser extent, Fagushan, Dhammajram, and so on, right? So all of these are post-war groups established in Taiwan and yet have international, global presence, right? So these groups share certain things in common, and I will just quickly list a few of them. As I just said, Foguangshan, Dhammajram, Ciji, they all have headquarters in Taiwan, founded by very charismatic leaders in the post-war period. And all of these groups have branches all around the world. This is something that you will be provided with if you do ethnography at Foguangshan, right? Very handily, very conveniently, right? And so here you see, right, Taiwan being kind of, situated at the center, with kind of arrows going into different directions. And very often you would even be given a list of all the branch temples in, all 4 continents and whatnot, right? So then, like I say, proudly provided by the organizations themselves, in presenting or representing their global and transnational presence and expansion, right? The third characteristic, sometimes, depending on which context I present it in, comes off as a bit offensive to the groups themselves. When I call them church-like organizations with strong corporate identity. Right? At one conference in Taiwan, someone in the audience actually raised their hands and said, "What do you mean by us having corporate identities?" Right? And then I just turned around the podium, pointed at the logos, the banners, the uniforms that the volunteers are wearing, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, we know what a corporate identity is here at SOAS, right? I mean, we just walk past your bookstore, or what do you call that, right? So that's what I mean by, church-like structurally, right? Centrally organized with a central management of personnel and assets, right? By the headquarters in Taiwan, while having, right, this kind of global presence. These groups, without a doubt, are very visible, very accessible to scholars who study Chinese Buddhism. And also, these groups, in a way, kind of represent a very familiar form to scholars who study them as well, right? In terms of the organizational model, in terms of their very clear and yet distinct messages, right, from kind of one another, in terms of the various NGOs that, they would have affiliated, really, big in, say, everything from charity to disaster relief to education, and so on and so forth, right? So in other words, this particular model of transnational Buddhism, right, captures all the familiar features for those of us trained in religious studies. And in a sense, they kind of represents the kind of good religion that we all want to study, right, and recognize. Don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with that. I love them. And yet, from a scholarly and critical point of view, what are the problems here? In them being predominantly represented, right, as the dominant form of modern Chinese globalism, for instance. So, here's the problem. Number one, the newness of this model that I just, characterized, right? Headquarters in Taiwan, branches all over, church-like, centrally managed, assets and personnel, clearly demarcated identity, corporate identities, and so on and so forth, right? So this incredibly modern, if I may use that term, right, way of organizing, get this, it's new. It's only been around for the last couple of decades. Dare I say that never in the history of Chinese Buddhism do you have this kind of organizational model and identity, right? So in other words, it's new. It's only been around for 40, 50 years. And what happened prior to that? How do we even talk about networks prior to the 1960s outside of Taiwan, right, in the Chinese Buddhist world? So to me, that, poses a very big problem. Number two, to me, that's an even bigger problem. as much as these groups are very visible, as much as these groups are very influential, locally in their local societies and globally, right? The majority of Chinese Buddhist monastics and temples do not follow this organizational model, and they do not identify with this kind of identity, right? Or expansion, model. So in other words, right, not only is this new, right, and the majority of Chinese Buddhist monastic and Chinese Buddhist temples also do not belong, to this way of identifying and expressing a Chinese Buddhist identity, right? So then, that was where I started, right? In other words, the questions that I had for myself was, okay then, what did we miss? More importantly, perhaps, how did we miss what we missed? Huh? And lastly, okay, I get it that maybe prior to this, networks and kinships in Chinese Buddhism had been fluid and decentralized, to use the word of our beloved Holmes Welch, right? Fluid and decentralized. But what are some of the possible analytical framework that we can potentially develop in order to better understand this, right? Because, like I say, there are other forms of Buddhism, right, that are equally transnational, as I will tell you in a moment, that are equally influential, and they are everywhere in the Chinese Buddhist world, and yet we don't see them. So why? How? And now how do we begin to take all of these groups and all of these expressions of identities into consideration in thinking about modern and contemporary Chinese Buddhism? So that basically was what I set out to do when I started to conceive this project. Okay? So now, to perhaps very quickly say a few words about how has scholars been talking about this whole issue of networks and affiliations, right? So again, right, going back to that kind of magnum opus of the classic in the field, Holmes Welch in 1967, right? So he did identify these various kinds of kinships and affiliations, right? So then, he says that, well, this is how, in terms of like considering kinship, people are related, in other words, right? You have these tonsure lineages, right? The Ti Mai, right? The Ti Du lineages. This is when a novice is ordained by a teacher and takes on, let's say, a lineage, that comes with, like, say, a Dharma name. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about lineage. And then eventually, this monk, nun, would go to a larger monastery and receive full ordination. So then you do have like ordination as a lineage, although the monastic might only stay there for, again, depending on which monastery and what time and so on, anything from 1 to 3 months, right, in training, studying the Vinaya, getting the ordination, and then perhaps returning either to their home temple or starting to travel and, visit different monasteries and, learning about, everything from a scripture to meditation, right? And then you also have this so-called Dharma transmission, the Tranfa lineages, right? When you have, let's say, maybe in a Chan monastery, when a Chan master identifies, right, somebody, usually by the late imperial time, we're talking about identifying somebody as a successor, right, to the abbotship of a public monastery, and therefore transmitting the Dharma lineage, whether we're talking about a Linji lineage or a Caodong lineage or one of the Chan lineages, right? So here we have, therefore, right, kinship, right, manifesting in these various, in a way, transmission practices. And then Welsh also talks about networks surrounding charismatic leaders or charismatic teachers, right? And then in the Republican era, we do have quite a few of them, right? Everyone from like Hong Yi, Tai Xu, Tan Xu, Yuan Ying, Xu Yun, and you name them, right? And there have even been like attempts to kind of come up with ideas such as there are 4 great masters of the Republican period, as in we only have room for 4, right? The 5th would have to be a footnote or something like that, right? So that's that, right? I mean, networks around these charismatic teachers. And then lastly, Welch identifies regionalism as an important way of forming networks. So in other words, if you are from Fujian, right, you speak the same dialects with your fellow monastics, and therefore, I mean, it's easier for you to form, whatever kinship network with them, versus someone who is from, let's say, the Northeast, who can't even understand what you're saying, right? So then, therefore, right, I mean, it makes it, the regional identity makes it easier to form these, networks. So I think, it is very, very interesting and very important that Holmes Welch recognizes these, different forms of networks and kinships and affiliations, right? But what is really interesting is that in that very same, publication, and to use his words, he's saying how all these different ways of identifying and forming affiliations overlapped and interplay kind of haphazardly. And haphazard is the word that he uses, right? So in other words, well, yeah, how do you then, talk about this kind of overlap between the different ways of identifying? It's like, it's kind of random. Maybe they just happen to be, or to belong to one of these. My intervention or my original thought was that, okay, wait, maybe, just maybe, it's not so haphazard. But then how would it actually work? And maybe, just maybe, if we are able to find out about that, that might help offer a better way of thinking about networks and kinship in Chinese Buddhism. So basically, that was the kind of background to how this whole project on Tiantai was conceived. And then, how and why did I even decide to look at, of all of these, right, different networks, how did I decide that perhaps a Dharma transmission, right, is something that can be singled out, as a way to start thinking about networks? That was a little random, I have to admit. And I don't know if one of you have already heard the story, but I'll tell it again. And so in very, very unexpected way. Can't remember whether it was 2015, 2014. It has to be close to 10 years now, okay? So I was attending a vegetarian banquet as a fundraiser for a Buddhist temple. I don't know, remember going to one of these yan hui, 10-course dinner, quick anti-Buddhist, right? And then you're stuck there, you're bored, and then it just keeps going and going and going. They keep bringing dishes. And at that time, I didn't have anyone. I didn't know anyone at the table, right? So I was bored and kind of look around me and then try to kind of, make small talks with, fellow monks and nuns, across the table. And of course, eavesdropping on people's conversation, right? And that was where I heard about this trip. And they describe it as a pilgrimage that a group of monastic, some of them at my table, were talking about because they just returned from that trip. It was a trip that this group took to a city called Yingkou in Liaoning province. It's a small city in the northeastern part of China where they visited this monk by the name Yuan Shan. Of course, as you can tell, right, he's now already, he turned 105 this year. Okay? And the place, it's called Lengyan Si in Yingkou. Right? I have to admit that as a specialist of the Republican era, I remember encountering the name. But I couldn't recall exactly why I remember that name. And then I had a few speculations because it was the Dongbei area, right? And it turned out that I was kind of right. I guessed it right, that it was associated with this Tiantai monk Tan Xu, right? Who moved back to Dongbei and then revived and constructed quite a few temples, right? And before he even, moved or relocated to Hong Kong, right? So I was right when I vaguely thought, since when would you take a Buddhist pilgrimage trip, right, to Dongbei? And so it turned out that I was right. So basically, right, this was a trip that they took to pay respect to their patriarch after a Dharma transmission ceremony that took place in Singapore, where the Tiantai Dharma transmission was given to, if I remember correctly, now that it's been a while, 4 or 5 monastics. Okay? The teacher who did the transmission is a Singaporean monk who received his Tiantai Dharma lineage from a Tiantai master in Hong Kong. And so, who was now doing the transmission ceremony, passing down the Tiantai lineage to one nun from Singapore, another nun from Malaysia, a mainland monk who traveled to Singapore to receive the Dharma transmission, and an American monk who is a Chinese Vietnamese. Okay. So then the Dharma transmission happened, right, in Singapore, and then after that, together, they took a trip to Yingkou to pay respect to their great grand teacher, right? The monk Yuan Shan. So that, I have to say, was when I started to seriously look into the role of Dharma transmission or lineage networks, as I call them, the Chuanfa, right, network, in order to think about transmission and kinship in modern Chinese Buddhism. So this is their transmission scroll, very, very Tiantai specific, right? Because you have Folong referring to, this spot, right, on Tiantai Mountain, and attributed to Ziyi, right, the founder of the Tiantai school, and close up of that, right. So this was when I started to really kind of think about identity and the importance or the significance of networks, lineage networks, and later on, which you will hear about on Saturday. I also tried to analyze or to do the same kind of analytical work with another lineage network, with the Fujian Yongquan Si lineage. Right? So today, for this talk, I will talk about the Tiantai network as our case studies. Okay? So, very, very quickly, just background information. The quote-unquote revival, I use it only very reluctantly because, again, right, it is true that it will have to decline to a point where perhaps, it's almost beyond reviving. And then, when it got revived, you're like, oh yeah, look at that. There's a revival of the Tiantai lineage, right, in the 20th century. Very reluctantly, I use the term because, again, I am very reluctant to overemphasize, this grand narrative of the decline of the decline of Chinese Buddhism since the Tang Song period until everything got revived, right, in the 20th century. So, and I want you to be really cautious as well. So, but if we were to talk about a so-called revival, right, or reinterpretation, or, representation, right, of Tiantai, very often it would start, right, with this Tiantai monk, Di Xian, who is a Jiangsu native. Okay? One really interesting thing, and very often Di Xian would be classified in scholarship of Chinese Buddhism as the conservative faction, whatever that word means. Right? But apparently, very charismatic, extremely influential within the business and the political world, and among the cultural elite. Very respected teacher. One thing that don't often get mentioned about Di Xian, since he's conservative, right? So then, he, in other words, could be like anti-reformist of all the reformist projects that the reformers have, right? Di Xian was actually very influential, very important in the earliest days of modern Buddhist educational reform in China. Just to give you a few examples. He taught at Yang Wenhui's Jetavana, right, in 1906, 1907, okay? And when that school failed, and when he left, he moved on, and he actually, was one of the founders of the Jiangsu Sangha School, the Jiangsu Seng Shifan Xuetang. So, 1909, when they were trying to protect temple properties from, all the confiscation campaigns and so on, he was there trying to found a monastic school. Right? And later on, when he became the abbot of this historically important Guanzhong Si in Ningbo, he opened a monastic school, right? The the Guanzhong Yanjiu She and the Guanzhong Xue She in 1913. It was founded because Di Xian became the abbot of the Guanzhong Monastery, right? So just to give you, an kind of example of how this supposedly very conservative monk was very actively involved, in educational reform. Okay, so Di Xian, in his other role, was also the 43rd generation of Tiantai Dharma lineage recipient. Okay, so, and therefore, from Di Xian on, right, he was known for transmitting the Tiantai lineage to various students of his. Okay? So the famous so-called Dongbei Sanlao, in that they all have northeastern China origin, right? Tanxu, Lego, and Dingxi, and they got their transmission from Di Xian. Okay? So today, just for the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on Tanxu. Not to say that that was the only prominent Tiantai sublineage, right? But we're going to just focus on Tanxu. So Tanxu was a northeastern China native. So then he attended Di Xian's Guanzhong school, and upon finishing, he was told by Di Xian, to go back to his home province, his home region, to spread Buddhism, because the Jiangnan area already had all these teachers. According to Di Xian, Tanxu, who was familiar with everything in the Dongbei area, should return to Dongbei and promote Buddhism. And he did. So he returned to northern China and started to revive and construct quite a number of monasteries everywhere from Shandong in Qingdao, right, to Dongbei, Changchun, Dalian, Harbin, as well as Yingkou, the temple that I just mentioned. And with the war, he started to move around and eventually relocating to Hong Kong in 1950, where he founded the South China Buddhist Academy, Huanan Xuefuyuan. The school only lasted about 6 years. It admitted 2 classes and graduated around 22, depending on how you count. Sometimes you find records that say 24 students when it has to close. And I'll tell you about the Robert H. N. Ho family and the Huanan Foshuyan connection in a moment. There's a connection there. But to very quickly tell you about that connection, it used to be affiliated with the Donglian Jueyuan, the Donglian Gaoyuan, and then given to Tanshu as a location for his school. And eventually, when that school closed, it went to different people. And at one point, it was part of the Buddhist Association. They tried to run a school there. And in the 90s, it was returned to the Donglian Jueyuan, or the TLKY, right? Those of you who are familiar with the contemporary Chinese Buddhist world, this Hongfa Jingshi in the photo is now the editorial office for Buddhist Store, the Buddhist News website. Okay, so the editors, and all the writers, who worked for Buddhist Store full time, they have their offices now in the in the Hongfa Jingshi. So that's the Robert Ho family connection, right? So now the school only lasted a few years. He graduated 2 classes of students, right? And it seems like, at least on the surface, that's how, in a way, right, that visibility or dominance ended, right? But I'll tell you. So Tan Xu came up with this very innovative practice, or he was forced to come up with this very innovative practice. Traditionally, Dharma transmission, especially in the Chan lineages, would be only given to successors to the abbotship. Right? So you identify successors, and usually you do it to quite a few of them so that they could take turn and whatnot. But again, right? I mean, usually Dharma transmission at a huge public Chan monastery is done to identify the next generation of leadership. Well, Tiantai was never one of those, resource-filled lineages or monastery, plus the fact that these were refugee monks in Hong Kong. They had very little. They could barely even sustain the school, not to mention, oh yeah, here, take Dharma transmission because I'm going to give the monastery to you. There's no monastery to pass down, right? So then Tan Xu came up with this very innovative practice in which she said, from now on, the transmission of the Tiantai lineage would only be done to competent people without succession of temple abbotship. 传法 Dharma transmission, 不传坐 without the transmission of the abbotship. Or in a sense, there's no abbotship to transmit, right? So, and that also therefore gave him the kind of like freedom, right, to do Dharma transmission, especially, when he identified, really promising students, within his school and so on. Right? So then where he also did, quite a few Dharma transmission. And then he would send them away, right, everywhere to, from Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and of course, most notably, North America. Okay? So, to perhaps just very, very quickly wrap up my point about this section so that we can maybe talk more about it in the Q&A. So, to fast forward, here is what happened with the Tiantai lineage, not just of Tan Xu, but also of other Tiantai monks such as Le Guo and Ding Xi. when Huiyue, this Tiantai monk living in Taiwan, wrote about the Tiantai lineage, he published this book in 1982, in which he said that over 50% of all Buddhist temples in Hong Kong has a Tiantai affiliation. Half of the temples in Hong Kong has some kind of a Tiantai connection. Going back to my question, what did we miss? How did we miss that, right? There's another example. Okay, let me see, where am I? So Huiyue, who wrote that book, is an extremely learned Tiantai monk, right, who attended Risho University in Japan. Another really prominent Tiantai heir. A lot of us know about Huafan University, the first ever Buddhist university. It was founded by one of Tan Xu's students, the nun Xiaoyun, right? Xiaoyun Fashi, who was a Tiantai nun, right? Now, for over maybe half a century, the Hong Kong Buddhist Association was led by Jie Guang, a Tiantai monk. For almost as long, the Macau Buddhist Association was somehow under the leadership of Yongxing, right? A Tiantai monk. Okay. Again, did we really not see how and why, right? Now, Tan Xu, without a monastery to transmit to his students, would encourage them to go far and teach, right? And far they went. Le Du, Changxiang, and Xingkong. By the way, Xingkong was, the longest-lived one who passed away only about 2 months ago. All right. So, and he was 101 or 102. Okay. So, these students, Le Du went first. First to San Francisco in 1963, and again, quite a few of you must have heard of it. He founded the Buddhist Association of the United States and the Young Men's Buddhist Association that did a lot of translation of Buddhist texts into English. The Sutra Translation Committee of the US and Canada was founded and led by Le Du for decades. Okay? So he first went to the States, and eventually he invited his 同学, his peers, Changxiang and Xingkong. And together, they went up to Toronto during the expo in Montreal and decided that Canada is this really inviting and welcoming country where they should settle, right? And they did. They founded the first Chinese temple in Toronto in 1968. And they named it after their home temple, Zhanshan Si, in Qingdao. That was where their teacher, Tan Xu, used to have a Foxue right, a Buddhist academy. So today, the Zhanshan Si remains the largest Buddhist temple in Toronto, and it has 9 branch temples and centers in Ontario, right? And until a few years ago, including a vegetarian restaurant. So now, the Zhanshan Si is in the process of building on a piece of land which is over 100 acres, an hour outside of Toronto, a Jianada Wu Taishan. During the Q&A, if you want, ask me why, they didn't try to build a Jianada Tiantai Shan. Okay, I will answer that question when they turn off the recording. Now, this is how it looks like an hour outside of Toronto. Okay, and this is before they close off the main hall, right? And this is the day before the massive opening ceremony literally a few months before COVID. So they're able to, do this, massive grand opening for the monastery, right? So now, so we have, therefore, right, everywhere from Hong Kong to Taiwan to Southeast Asia, and also, eventually to North America, this very fluid, very flexible, and yet, I would say, very visible network that self-identifies as Tiantai, but not exclusively, right? So then, in other words, what do we make of it? How do we understand it? And, what are some of the tools that we can potentially develop to better understand these forms of transnational expansion and connections? If we already know that we can't rely on the same model, that's exemplified by the Renjian Fujiao or humanistic Buddhist groups, right? So in other words, how are we even going to be able to talk about that? And of course, I put this slide together after, having given a few conference presentation on the Tiantai groups, right? I would have very senior scholar who study Tendai Buddhism in Japan who raise their hands and say, what makes your monks Tiantai monks? Do they do Tiantai scholasticism? Do they practice Tiantai meditation? What makes them Tiantai, right? And time and again, I have to go back to this and said, I don't decide who can call themselves a Tiantai monk. This is where the identity is based, right? And I can quiz them on Tiantai doctrine before I allow them to claim that identity, right? So in other words, as a scholar, as an observer, as someone who's trying to better understand these practices, what tools do I have, or what tools can I possibly develop in order to help us all understand these practices better, right? So in other words, therefore, like I say, I put these slides together, right, to ask all of us whether we are even asking the right questions, right? When we say what constitutes a modern Tiantai sectarian identity. Especially given that after having met quite a few of the recipients of the Dharma lineage, I can tell you that it is most certainly not exclusive. Some of them even have received multiple transmissions from multiple teachers, right? So their Tiantai identity is certainly not exclusive. And like I said, I promise during Q&A, I will tell you why they're trying to build Wu Taishan, but not Tiantaishan, right? So, therefore, to very, very quickly, perhaps, sum up what I have to say, and then maybe we can talk more about, all the questions that you might have during Q&A. To me, therefore, a Tiantai identity, or any one of these kinship or sectarian, not to mention that I don't really think that they're exclusively sectarian, right, represents a form of social religious capital. And it also is a manifestation of the very, very strategic use, right, of kinship and identity as an organizational kind of methods. Right? So in other words, when are candidates identified and why are candidates identified and so on and so forth. Their Tiantai identity, it's certainly very explicit in that they want to tell you about it. They want you to know that they have received this incredibly privileged, right, Dharma transmission. And yet, it is by no means exclusive. It doesn't exclude them from practicing other forms of Buddhism. It doesn't even exclude them from taking on other Dharma transmission from other teacher, not to mention, right, learning different forms of Buddhism from different teachers, right? And so, therefore, the hybridity and the cultural flexibility of this kind of identity, it's something that I would really like, to investigate, because I think that it has a lot to offer in our thinking about transnational or translocal transmission of Buddhism, right? In other words, when we call them American, Canadians, Chinese, Buddhist, or Tiantai, right? Which one of these identities or labels, right, to take front stage seem to depend on context, right? Sometimes it's the Chinese in the label that has to stand out. I attended the grand opening ceremony when you have, and it was also a few weeks before a federal election in Canada, when you literally have an entire parade of politicians trying to show up, right? And so that was when the Chinese identity took a very prominent place, because again, right, I mean, here, it's probably conceived also of, as a venue where you have the most direct access to this particular, I guess, group of voters and so on and so forth, right? But then, in their transnational or international exchanges, right, that Canadian or American identity, especially, say, back in the mainland and so on and so forth, it's also something that gets highlighted all the time, right? That you have an entourage, right, of representatives, from the U.S. and from Canada, right? And so, therefore, I really am interested in, therefore, investigating this intersection between modern Chinese Buddhist institution, diasporic kind of ethnic consciousness, and translocal or transnational spatial imagination. And of course, this is only a hypothesis, but I would like to be able to show eventually that there seems to be this continuous reconstruction of identity, and I'll maybe say one thing about that kind of like orthodoxy or shifting center of legitimacy. So now, as you can see, you have centers, right? Learned Tiantai monks and nuns in Taiwan. Great Tiantai patriarchs in Hong Kong. And then a lot of them relocated to everywhere from Hawaii to Toronto to New York, right? And after the 1980s, there's been a lot of efforts to reestablish connections with communities in mainland China, right? And so I think in addition to the reestablishment of connections, what we are seeing is also a constantly shifting center of authority and legitimacy, right? And so just to perhaps, tell a little kind of anecdote here. So when I ask a recipient of the Dharma transmission, I said, oh, did you get your transmission from so-and-so? And then, without reviewing too much, they said, oh no, that's too far down in the lineage. I got my transmission in Liaoning, right? The teacher got his transmission directly, right, from Tanxi. So then if you're to look at this chart, I am like 3 generations up from all those names that you just mentioned, right? So like I said, this is what I meant by a constantly shifting center of authority and legitimacy as well, right? So, in other words, we are talking about, quite a few really interesting and overlapping topics here that hopefully, right, would offer us something to think about as we think about like global Buddhism, right? And then or global Chinese Buddhism to be specific. And so then ultimately, I would like to be able to show that, we are seeing also a constantly continuous reconstruction of religious identities and orthodoxy, right? Which is really not shaped, necessarily by what happened locally, but by the border crossing experience of the participants, in this network. So I think I'm going to stop here, and then if you have questions, we can talk about that. Thank you so much.